welcome back to The Full View. South Africa celebrates the stride made by women every year in August by having reflective conversation about the conditionalities of women, past, present and futures. However, interlocutors on conversations about women in South Africa during this month are often accused of rendering trans women invisible by excluding them from the conversation about the conditionalities of women. What is the impact of this exclusion, and why is it the trans women should be rendered visible in the conversation? I discussed this evening with my esteemed panel, Dr. Vilakazi, Fikile Vilakazi, who's the Director of the Gender Equity Unit at the University of the Western Cape, as well as Abongile Kutu, a non-binary person and gender equality activist at Gender Dynamics. Perhaps to start the conversation with you, and thank you so much for joining us, really do appreciate it. Dr. Vilakazi, oftentimes the conversation about women in South Africa takes on the shape where it's spoken about in a very binary, heteronormative sense. It is often the case that the inclusion of non-binary or a non-binary conversation, as well as a non-heteronormative conversation, isn't one South Africans are easily able to access, because the language is not perhaps accessible because of misunderstandings around conceptualization of what it is to be a man, what it is to be a woman, and what that binary looks like in our day-to-day lives. Perhaps take us to the heart of this. Why is it, and what does the research tell us and the literature, that women who do not conform to that binary, that is to say, non-binary women or transgendered women, are excluded from the conversations about the issues that face women?
Good evening, Oliver, to you and Abongile on the studio and to viewers at home. The conversation about inclusion when we imagine womanhood in society is one that has faced us over time in South Africa, really just in terms of the binary society that we have been, which is something that emanates, if you look at literature in our lived realities, really it emanates from our socialization as a nation, but not unique to South Africa, but just socialization of society into, this idea that gender is between two binaries of a man and a woman. And South Africa is not immune to that. Those of us who've been at the forefront of the, activism in terms of LGBTQI livelihoods and being, particularly trans activism, will tell us, of course, that that is not necessarily the case. So what we have seen then, through research, through literature, but also through activism in our lived realities, we started to see in our country people who, we're beginning to affirm that particular reality, to say, I'm not the kind of person that you actually want me to be or desire me to be or name me even to be at birth, but this is who I am. And we've started seeing people, who are trans coming to affirmation, to saying this is who I am. And it's something that I think we are battling with as South African society, to understand that gender is not necessarily, a binary identity, but it's really an identity that we affirm for ourselves as human beings and as people, depending on how we express ourselves and how we are born even, and how we relate and position ourselves within society. And I think that affirmation has necessitated the fact that we need to then understand that we have multiple genders in society. Literature points us to that. There's an amazing body of literature that has emerged over time in the study of gender and sexuality that shows us that we don't just exist as men and women in society, but we exist as many other things, including being trans, including being non-binary, including being just, whatever we affirm ourselves to be. And that is our story. Society, and I think in the imagination of what we then call womanhood in society, it's very important and imperative that we expand that understanding for ourselves. And there's a lot of violation that has happened, Oliver, over time in that work, because we live in a society that forces, for lack of a better word, that imposes a particular body in terms of gender, a particular expression in terms of gender, which has then consistently, and it continues to do that, consistently violates those kinds of affirmations that says, this is who I am. And I think over time that has also been done. And there's also a body of literature that says this in research.
Can I pause you there?
Also just in our own experiences. That
Dr. Vilakazi, can I pause you there? Because perhaps just to double click in the points that you're making there, is that discrimination you're talking about happening at a social level or at an institutional level? I can understand at a social level where people are insistent on gender just being a function exclusively of biology. But at an institutional level, there's assumed more rationality happening there. And for instance, South Africa being one of the first countries in the world that recognizes, for instance, being able to undergo transsexual therapy as well as gender affirming therapy and even Home Affairs. If you are a trans person, you can go to Home Affairs, declare it and change your gender on your birth certificate or on your ID document. That is recognized at an institutional level. Incredibly progressive. Where is the cognitive dissonance?
Look, Oliver, South Africa is a country that is known for, for what other people would call a progressive constitution, but also we are a nation that has progressively put in legislation in place to affirm, different sexualities and genders and sexual orientations. And I think that's a point that we do need to put out there. The work that we have done as a nation since 1994, some of us have been at the forefront of that work, and we continue to be, is to do exactly that, transform legislation in a manner that enables, right? But in terms of then the lived reality, what we have seen is that even though we've got this progressive legislation in the context of trans human beings, for instance, in the country, you've got the Alteration of Sex Description Act, which I think is what you're alluding to.
Yeah.
But what we have seen is that at a practical level, at the level of officials, when we go to Home Affairs, when we want to affirm our gender, there's still a lot of misgendering. There's still a lot of blockages in the system. But I think Abongile perhaps can speak a lot about that.
Actually, let's do that. Abongile, you're a non-binary person. I would probably be rich if I had a rand for every time you get misgendered in society. From your experience, where do you think a great deal of that general misgendering stems from? Is it from a just sheer lack of understanding? And when you correct someone and say, hey, no, actually, that is not my pronoun, that is not my gender, and you correct that they say, oh, okay, cool, I understand, and they accept that? Or is there a continued insistence after the fact to continue misgendering you because there is just, it's a bigoted approach, so to speak? Where is the problem in society?
Good evening to all the listeners. My name is Abongile Kutu, as mentioned. I think the biggest issue within our society around misgendering does not only speak on socialization itself, but speaks to the content that that has been presented to us within our schools and how we have been positioned within the curriculum and also society, that gender is viewed in this single lens of a man and a woman in this particular view. And then when we come as trans and non-binary persons into the picture and we transgress the movement of understanding gender and sexuality, we are often faced with misgendering. And misgendering comes from some people use biology to back it up. Some people use the notions of Christianity and some religions to back their notions of misgendering people. And also how people have been groomed and grown within their homes and society. They constantly use those notions to misgender people. So there is quite a multifaceted view around how people misgender others in society. And misgendering continues most of the time, even when you inform people that, okay, this is me and this is how I identify. And people would use backlash and say, this is not how I'm groomed up in society. I will not conform to what you are trying to educate me into. I will continue to use this identities when I refer to you. And that is where the problem is. We face arrogance and ignorance from most people who are misgendering us in society. As a person myself, I've experienced a lot of misgendering. And when I try to explain myself that I'm a non-binary person, there's a constant backlash that I face. And this backlash is not only faced by me, but many of my trans and gender diverse siblings in the entire country. And I think it is important that we constantly use the feminism work that we are in to constantly educate and transgress space to be inclusive and welcoming. Because as Judith Butler wrote, gender is about self-discovery. There is no single view to what gender or womanhood is and what it is about.
Yeah, let's move the conversation here. And Abongile, this question is still for you. It is Bell Hooks that said, if it's not intersectional, it's not meaningful, right? I'm not just a woman, I'm also black. I'm not just a woman, I am queer, I'm not just a woman. I am all these other facets that make up my identity. Is the intersectionality conversation in how it is framed, at least in academia. Has the conversation about women and the conditionalities of women in South Africa been intersectional at any point? And has it been intersectional enough to the point where it is all-encompassing and inclusionary?
I think for me to answer your question, it has not been intersectional enough. The fact that we still have single views as to what womanhood is about, and the fact that womanhood is still reduced to genitalia, whereas gender is beyond that and womanhood is beyond that. So there hasn't been an understanding, a clear understanding of the intersectionalities that exist beyond our bodies and the intersectionalities of what womanhood is about. So there's still so much work that we need to do. For example, I'm a black trans non-binary person, and I come with a lot of experiences from my township, from being in university, from coming from a village in Dudua. There's intersecting issues that I've experienced and positionalities of myself that have shifted from the environment I have been. So it is important when we do this work that we understand that the work of intersectionalism has not really been done in society. It has only been done in silos or in spaces like academia. So in terms of academia, the work is there, it is written about, but in terms of practicality within our society, we still lack understanding of intersectionalism that exists within womanhood and beyond.
Dr. Vilakazi, will we ever settle the question conclusively on what is a woman? The Olympics board seems to be struggling with that question right now. And the definition changes on who you're speaking to. To some people, it is a measurement of testosterone and estrogen in your body. For some people, it is about the performance of your genitalia. And for other people, it is a myriad of other things that could be arbitrary in terms of determining what it is to be a woman. For some people, it is a level of femininity. Like I said, it's varied. Will it ever come to a point where we can settle the question?
Oliver, you know, the question of gender and identity and expression is really a fragile property of us as human beings. And I think how we settle it, really, we have to go to a place of self-determination. There is nobody, no one, none of us, not government, not individuals, not activists, can tell us who we are. We are the people that can self-determine that this is who I am, even from the very point of birthing, you know, which is why we are arguing to say at the point of birth, do not genitally mutilate until a human being can self-determine to say, this is who I am, society. And I think that's how we're going to settle it. At this point, we are battling, even within the most progressive of minds, Oliver, you know, which is a sad thing, amongst the feminists, you know, amongst human rights activists, amongst really voices in society that have, you know, predominantly been progressive, but still battling with this question of womanhood in society. Look at what's happening in sports. Things that Caster Semenya has been going through in the country, you know, tell us that we have not arrived at that place, but we can settle it. That is my argumentation. I think we just need to understand that only a human being can self-determine gender, can self-determine even sexuality. You know, sexuality in itself is a construct. Who determines whether you're a man or a woman at birth, or you are non-binary or anything? It's only you as a human being. But what we have seen is a violation of that self self-determination, even from the process of birthing, where we relegate that responsibility to doctors, we relegate that responsibility to the state, we relegate that responsibility to mother or father or parent. So how we settle it, Oliver, really it's a question of going back to saying, if we firmly believe in the fundamental basic aspects of human rights, we are going to then say as society, let us allow human beings to self-determine gender. And we can do it, that is my belief. But I think we have to deal with our egos, even as the most progressive of minds, and say, who am I? Let us deal with our biases, check our power, and then allow and enable self-determination. And I think we can do it if we really go to that place of reflexivity and say, Fikile, I cannot tell anyone else to say this is what they should be. It has got nothing to do with what lies between our legs. I always argue, genitalia does not determine who we are, but self-determination does, expression does, and only a human being can tell.
Yeah. Abongile, there is even a continued tension around this very dialectic about what it is to be a woman amongst feminist thinkers, and feminist scholarship itself is not settled on this question. Of course, taking you back to 2015, 2014, when renowned Nigerian author Chimamanda came forward and said, well, I am a feminist, I speak on women issues, but a trans woman who was not born a woman, has not experienced the world in its entirety as a woman, some of the privileges and some of the protections that men receive in society by the mere fact of being born with a penis is extended to trans women because they exist in that eugenic framework. Chimamanda was then since labeled a trans exclusionary feminist, and that's when the scholarship of trans exclusionary feminism came about. So if the most thoughtful of feminists in the world still don't agree on it, how do we translate that conversation into everyday society where we can be meaningful about the inclusion of trans women into the conversation about women issues?
I think one of the most important things drawing from your question is that we need to understand that in our opinions and our reflections in society, they are all social constructs. We have been conditioned to think certain ways, and we think in certain ways because of what we've consumed in society. And I think we must understand that feminism is broad, and trans people have been the background and the movers of the gender revolution and feminism work. And we need to understand that feminism comes in various ways, and it is multifaceted. It is not single-lined, and it is not single viewed. And when we start to understand that background, drawing to what Dr. Fikile was saying earlier on, that self-determination should be the ground of the work that we do. We know that there are feminists who are against trans people, and we must understand that self-determination should be the backdrop of everything. And when we allow people to be and to self-determine, and then we'll have a ground of womanhood that is diverse, that is multifaceted, that is multicultural, and our different views of feminism will then intersect to embody what womanhood is about. The moment you start bashing another woman, it means that you are against womanhood and the work that we do as feminists in the world. We've seen in the news the anti-gender movement penetrating the African context, using culture, using different perspectives to put trans people behind. But the most important thing that we need to understand, trans people are here, trans people exist, and trans people who identify as women are women enough. Because as Dr. Fikile said earlier, womanhood is not defined by genitalia. So genitalia should not be used as a basis of identifying people's gender identities.
Yeah. Dr. Vilakazi, perhaps to ask you this question, taking on from what Abongile had just said now, South Africa is a society where institutions like culture and religion remain rigid, perhaps brittle, but incredibly important as a mobilizing and galvanizing platform for the ideas that make us who we are as a society. When you look at the rigidity of culture and religion around the conceptualization of who is what, and you think about the plight, the conditionalities, and the violence that non-binary people and trans women live through, how do you go to those forums and have that conversation about self-determination that you say is the bedrock of the social change that needs to happen?
Oliver, I have a lot of anecdotes to answer that question. In fact, facts. When we started, a couple of years ago, when we were engaging on this activism, we were, particularly around same-sex marriages, we, for instance, galvanized the South African Council of Churches. We worked with the traditional leadership in the form of the National House of Traditional Leaders. We worked with Contralesa, and so on. And that work continues. So there are voices within these particular social systems that are not necessarily voices that are antagonistic. There are progressive voices within those spaces that have enabled a number of transformation, in terms of legislation and policy that we have done in the country. And I'm speaking here as a traditional healer myself, existing within structures that you call traditional in the country. And I'm very aware, Oliver, that within, for instance, the paradigm of African traditional health, we do not have anything that is called a man or a woman or anything. The understanding of gender within the institution of traditional health, for instance, affirms the fact that I can call myself ubaba, even if I have a vagina, which means that ubaba, which is something that you would ordinarily within other structures of culture could be seen as a male-bodied person with a penis. But within a traditional health system, for instance, and I'm making an example, that is not necessarily the case. A man who is born with a penis, or somebody, a human being, who's born with a penis, can identify as ukoko, which is something in another system of culture and tradition could be seen as what society sees as a woman. So there are nuances that I think we can borrow from. If you look at the institution of royalty, for instance, look at the Mujaji institution of matriarchy, it tells us also a story that there are systems that we can borrow from within our traditions, within our belief systems, within our bodies of conscience that affirm the fact that African societies have not always been binary. We are societies that have always gone beyond the binary, and literature points to that. I can give you a point of reference on the book that we wrote, for instance, with the experiences of Africanness in this context all over Africa, a book that is called Lesbian Men, Female Husbands, and Ancestral Wives, which points to this and many other references that I can point, Oliver. So there are places within tradition and culture and belief and conscience that are progressive that we can borrow from. But what has happened is that in this conversation, society somehow has tended to just concentrate on the negative components of this work. And I think we need to go there and have this conversation and say, this is who we are, and affirm ourselves. And I can say a lot, but I'll stop here, Oliver, just to give Abongile a chance to speak as well.
Abongile, I've got literally 1 minute left, and please do answer this for me in 1 minute. Are there conditionalities pertaining to violence and social ills, like the gender pay gap, for instance, that affect women that for some reason don't affect trans women in South Africa? Or are those conditionalities transferable and almost always affect trans women?
I think in terms of what you are mentioning now, in terms of conditionalities, trans women experience much more violence in society because of who they are and how they self-determine within society. They are constantly faced by attack. They are constantly faced by judgment. They are constantly faced by discrimination. And I want to say that, as I mentioned earlier, we have intersecting issues as women in society. So in terms of intersecting and understanding that we need to work towards equality, we must understand that we all experience issues within society. So a woman who identifies as a cis woman still does experience a lot of challenges and troubles within society. And as much also a trans woman experiences a lot of issues within society. And these conditionalities sometimes are the same and sometimes are different and sometimes are beyond, because we live and exist in various spaces. So there is not a single line of understanding the violences that our women experience in society. Thank you.
Yeah, that's where we're going to have to leave it. Dr. Fikile Vilakazi, thank you so much for your time this evening. Abongile, thank you so much for your time. Really do appreciate it. This conversation, of course, is an incredibly difficult conversation, one that has to be approached with an immense level of sensitivity. And as Women's Month continues, we unpack the various aspects of it here on the SABC News channel throughout the month of August. Let's take a break. On the other side of this, we continue with the full view.